Hello, my name is Riva Bala, and today I'm joined by Stratfor Eurasia analyst Mark Lantham to talk about the next steps in the Eurasia standoff. So, Mark, we've had a busy morning. First, we have the Crimea referendum moved up again, now to March 16th. And on top of that, a move by Russia saying that they will extend citizenship not just to ethnic Russians in Ukraine, but to Russian-speaking citizens in former Soviet Union states. Let's get into the mind of Russia right now. What are they thinking? This is clearly an escalation in the standoff, but what are the next steps here?
So I disagree a little here. I don't think that this is an escalation by Russia. And as you mentioned, these two camps, the West, mainly the European Union and the United States, are negotiating strongly over the future status of Ukraine. That being said, escalation is a bit of a strong word here. I think Russia is very much conscious of its own limitations in how far it can go in pushing Europe, and things like granting citizenship to Russian-speaking and ethnically Russian people in anywhere else than Ukraine and the Caucasus would be seen as a very, very aggressive move by the European countries. And I think this is something that Russia has demonstrated it's not willing to do.
But it's defining that negotiation where you are going to have escalatory moves. And I do see this as ratcheting up the pressure. Take the referendum, for example. It's no longer a question of whether Crimea will be independent and Russia can say, look, this is the Crimeans deciding their future. This is about Crimea is either in Ukraine, stays in Ukraine, or becomes part of Russia. It's made it very bipolar. And so I think the message there from Russia's perspective is, look, Europeans need to recognize that Crimea, that phase is over. This is de facto ours. We are moving on. Now, it's that question of how Russia moves on in the rest of Ukraine and along its periphery, where we're going to see some nuance in tactics. And there I totally agree with you, because we have two different camps here, right? Moldova and Georgia, for example, versus the Baltic states, which I think are very unnerved by the idea of Russian-speaking citizens then becoming part of Russia.
Absolutely. One thing I would caveat is Crimea, we shouldn't think too much of Crimea's decision to be annexed into Russia as a strong move. Crimea was de facto a Russian province. It held one of the largest military bases of the Russian Navy. Its population is majoritarily Russian, ethnically Russian. So in a sense, Russia is trying to annex something it already was already theirs. So I don't think that constitutes an escalation. As you mentioned, the next step and what's going to happen to the rest of Ukraine, I think it's pretty clear what Russia wants. And it's what Russia has wanted for the longest time, which is to keep Ukraine steadily as a buffer, a geopolitical buffer between itself and the West. It does not want to see Ukraine join NATO or the EU, because that places the West right at the doors of Moscow. And that is something that's unacceptable. That is the red line for Russia. That said, the Baltics to me seems like a distraction. I think we are seeing Russia amping up this rhetoric and this pressure only for the benefit of its negotiated settlement over the status of Ukraine. But I don't think we are going to see an escalation in action in those countries, only in Ukraine and only in, as you mentioned, Georgia and Moldova.
Right. So, okay, let's start with Georgia and Moldova, because right now, economically speaking, Russia is, of course, incurring a cost here, but it's willing to, right? It's making a very clear point that we have to have an understanding, primarily between the Russians and the Germans, on what does it mean to neutralize these peripheral states, that it can't swing one way or another. Georgia and Moldova, extremely economically dependent on the Russians. So Russia's basically saying, Europe, how much do you want to subsidize these states when you've got major problems on your own?
Right. And as you mentioned, the unfolding economic crisis in Europe is definitely one of the main reasons why Russia feels confident right now taking those moves. But, look at the big picture and look at the long-term strategy of Russia and what, it's exhibited since the Putin presidency. Russia is an inherently vulnerable state in the sense that it's facing a steep demographic decline. Its main source of revenue is and has been energy exports. They've tried to diversify it into industrialize, and they have failed at that. So Putin is a very smart man, and he sees Russia in the long term as not being as stable as it is today. So,
which is why in the short term you need to show your leverage while you still have it.
Which is why in the short term you consolidate your defenses as much as you can. Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia are Russia's defenses. Those are defensible positions because they lock on the Carpathians, they lock the Caucasus, and they lock the southern European flank. They already control Belarus, so that takes care of the northern European plain. So in that sense, Russia only wants to neutralize those countries to make sure that they don't go up to the perceived enemy, which is the West. Once that is done, that is all Russia wants. I don't think Russia wants to do anything more than that, but to control those countries. And it will use any, and by any I mean any means necessary to make sure that happens. Let's not forget that they invaded Georgia in 2008 to make sure it didn't join NATO.
But different tactics for different countries. And that's where energy gets really interesting, because that is way more nuanced in how you apply that lever. The Poles, for example, are likely going to be asking for discounts from the Russians in a renegotiation. They can act like the crisis in Ukraine has nothing to do with that negotiation, but of course it does. So when the Russians are negotiating natural gas prices, knowing how incredibly dependent the Europeans remain on them, how far can it afford to go in tightening the economic screws?
Well, the dependency is not one way, and I think that would be my answer, is that Russia itself is extremely dependent on the European market for its revenues. I mean, we're talking about a state where oil and gas exports account for almost 80% of the budget. And Europe is by far the largest chunk of that. So we're seeing concurrently with that dependency, the bilateral dependency, we're also seeing the Europeans in the past 5 years have become a much more integrated set of countries. The EU has managed to create physical and legal connections between those countries so that the more and more the EU is a single market for energy. And because it is such a large market, it can apply large amounts of pressure on Russia. So there are very, very strong limits to how far Russia can go in using energy as an intimidating factor, as it used to do, if you remember the Ukraine wars and the Ukraine gas wars in 2004 and 2007. We can't do that anymore. The Russians cannot do that anymore. And I think that places a strong limit. So I think the Russians are going to be very, very careful in how they deal with energy. They're going to make sure that they continue to undercut any other competitor on the continent, and they're going to make sure that they lock those markets, Poland, Germany, Italy, the big ones, into long-term contracts. And that's all they're going to do. They're going to be very careful to not mix politics and business. And I think that's a defining feature of Russia.
The defining feature of Russia is that Russia has to mix politics and business because energy is its state tool. And so, while you're right that they will be careful in how they apply it, and they will want to undercut prices, particularly for the Baltic states. They have, their LNG plans coming online within the year. And while it's a very strategic option for them to have, the Russians know they can still undercut them. They're still the most proximate, massive supplier to the Baltic states, and they know that. And that still is going to be used in this broader negotiation.
Sure, but those levers are weakening. And they're going to continue to weaken as the European Union gets better and better connected, and as Brussels has more power, which they will get to negotiate jointly for energy prices. And I think that's a very important shift that we're seeing in Russia, is that Russia is going to start to have to behave, and especially Russian export companies, particularly Gazprom, they're going to have to behave like a regular business looking to maintain a market share, and not as this monopolistic behemoth that can, be a tool of policy for the Kremlin. It's not an overnight transition, but it is underway. And the biggest proof of that is how Gazprom has granted discounts of natural gas to countries that 10 years ago it would have been unthinkable. Poland, the Baltics, those were countries that paid some of the highest gas prices in the world, even though they were next door to the largest gas producer in the world. And that was extremely political. And in the past couple of years, now they're paying very average prices. And I think that really highlights how the European Union, despite all of its weakness, despite all of its crisis that it's going on, is a force that is forcing Russia to reconsider how it operates.
Okay, maybe more pragmatic energy policy, but we still have major military moves in places like Ukraine. Different category for the Baltics, but in any case, we're going to see a lot more moves out of the Russians while they feel this is their moment to get the message across with a very distracted United States and a Europe consumed with its own internal crises.
Right. And I completely agree with that as far as Ukraine is concerned, as far as Georgia is concerned, and as far as Moldova is concerned, because those are countries that really are in flux and neutral right now. The Baltics is another ballgame because those are countries that are in the EU. One of them is in the Eurozone, and they're also in NATO. And I think at this moment, Russia has not and probably never had an actual capability to go toe-to-toe with NATO and with the EU as a whole. It must preserve its relationship with Germany, which is its largest trade partner as far as energy goes, and it will not jeopardize that relationship in the Baltics. So if all of those moves we're talking about, particularly the ones, the military ones, we will only see them on the southern periphery of Russia.
Except I don't think the Lithuanians feel that way. We actually have to cut off here, Mark. Thank you for the conversation.
Thank you.
We'll be watching all of these moves and more at Stratfor.com. Thank you for joining us.